You're listening to Now I've Heard Everything, conversations with the icons of our time.
I measure exploitation in an economic sense. I'm an economist by background, and the difference between the value of their services and what they were actually getting was so tremendous that I felt they were the most exploited group I had ever met.
Former Baseball Players Union Chief Marvin Miller, today on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson. Today is Labor Day. So I wanted to share with you an interview I did more than 30 years ago with one of the most influential labor leaders of our time. In 1966, Marvin Miller was elected the executive director of the Major League Baseball Players Association. By the time he retired, 16 years later, Miller had helped transform not just the Players Association, but basically the entire professional sports industry. Miller started by negotiating the baseball players' first ever collective bargaining agreement in 1968. And it was Miller's leadership and the courage of St. Louis Cardinals outfielder Curt Flood that finally brought an end to baseball's antiquated reserve clause, which essentially gave a team complete ownership of a player to be bought and sold like property. In fact, it's largely because of Marvin Miller and the Players Association that we now have the entire concept of free agency, not just in baseball, but across professional sports. Red Barber, in fact, once called Marvin Miller one of the 2 or 3 most important figures in all of baseball history. Miller wrote a book in 1991 called A Whole Different Ballgame, and that's when I had the chance to sit down for a few minutes with this icon of labor. In a moment, our conversation.
No, Sherman, this isn't the Wayback Machine, but it is a look back at an interview from the 30-year archive of national radio personality Bill Thompson. Enjoy.
So here now, from 1991, Marvin Miller.
I suspect you've read the same reviews that I've read of your book, and they usually somewhere in there mention that you're not shy about taking credit for some of these things. But, I thought when I was reading those reviews, why should you be shy? If you did it, take credit for it.
Well, I think some of the criticism is not quite accurate and not well taken. Sure, I'm not shy, and I take credit when I think it's appropriate. I'm trying to write a book that is accurate. But I think a careful reader and one who is doing this without bias will see that I have repeatedly pointed out that the accomplishments of the Players Association were never a one-man job. I have repeatedly talked about people like Dick Moss, who was the general counsel and very capable. And more than that, I have explained what the reality is, that you cannot have a successful union, which this was and is, without a great membership that understands what you're doing and cooperates with you in every way. So that what may appear to an uninitiated reader about trade unions as taking credit, I disagree. I think that I have carefully explained that what anybody should know in the first place, that the accomplishments of a union which has become as significant as the Major League Baseball Players Association clearly is not a one-man job.
Did you get that understanding and that cooperation that you mentioned a moment ago? Did you get that from the get-go, from the first day?
No. From the beginning, I think it was clear what the difficulty was. Players had been given propaganda by owners for years and years, those players and their predecessors. They had been told repeatedly that baseball is not a business, it's a sport, that owners don't make money and in fact are not in it to make money, they're just sportsmen. And players were told they ought to feel eternally grateful just to be allowed to put on a uniform and play ball. And they were told that that terribly restrictive reserve rule system under which they operated, which made a player property, literally, they were told that if you attempted to amend that in any way, baseball would just collapse. Well, all of this was junk, but players are very young people, and I'm not saying all of them swallowed this propaganda whole, but enough so that they were understandably perplexed about what was appropriate to do, which direction to go. And the mammoth job in the beginning was an educational job, to begin to get players to see what the facts were rather than the mythology. And so that the initial reception, while I guess you could say I was favorably received, I won election by a vote of 489 to 136, and a good part of the 136 were, under the peculiarities of that election, were management people. They were coaches, trainers, and managers. But as time went on, the support for the organization and the support for me became just terrific and solid as anything could be.
It was quite a different game then than it is now, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's why the title of A Whole Different Ballgame. It really did change things. The union, which began 25 years ago, July 1st was the 25th anniversary, and one of the reasons I wanted to write this book is that although baseball and baseball players get a tremendous amount of publicity, everybody writes about them day in and day out, and a lot of the material, a lot of the books written about baseball are good, but basically they're all single-dimensional with respect to the players. And understandably, they deal with the player as athlete, player as jock on the field. About the only time you get any kind of rounded feeling about what players are like is when they get in trouble. And I knew the players from a very completely different angle. I knew them as young people who had been sold a bill of goods in the beginning, who did not have any idea of what their worth was. And I watched them mature and learn. They eventually learned more about the business of baseball than the owners, literally. And I watched them become mature people, good trade unionists, many of them activists, many of them gained negotiating skills as part of negotiating committees through those years. And I wanted to get that picture of the player across because nobody else has done that, and I was in a unique position to do that.
To so many people, many fans, it's just it all boils down to money. But it goes far beyond just money, though.
Oh yes, and it is essential to know that when I started, money was not the issue. I felt that the players were easily the most exploited group I had ever seen, because I measure exploitation in an economic sense. I'm an economist by background, and the difference between the value of their services and what they were actually getting was so tremendous that I felt they were the most exploited group I had ever met. But there was none of that feeling among the players. They did not feel underpaid. The issues were far different than that. They were concerned, at the time I first met them, they were concerned about a tax on their pension plan by the owners. And they were also concerned, without articulating it, they were concerned that the reserve rule system really left them without dignity in the workplace. And I know that everybody now talks about money and how much the salaries have increased, and I understand that. But it is so important to understand that back then, players were not dealing with the issue of money. Mickey Mantle, who was an active player when I came in, who has written another book recently, has spoken frankly about it. He said people now ask him, about his salary as compared with salaries of present players and so on. He always has a very classy answer. People goad him. They want him to say that present players make too much. And Mickey and Joe DiMaggio both give classy answers. They say, present players don't make too much. We made too little. But Mantle in his book says very frankly, I never considered myself underpaid at the time. And the reason, of course, is that he had not the faintest idea of what the value of his services was worth. And the matter of the reserve rules, and for your listeners who may not really understand that whole restrictive system, typically a player entered baseball, professional baseball, by being drafted by one organization, usually right out of high school at a tender age of 17 or 18, and told that he can deal only with one organization. And he either takes whatever terms they offer, or he cannot play professional baseball anywhere in the world. Now, American employees, young or old or middle-aged, wouldn't accept that system for 10 minutes. But that was what was in effect for 80 and 90 years. And the young player, faced with that kind of lack of options, signed a professional contract. And from that point on, he was the property of that organization. Unless they decided to sell him for cash, literally, or unless they decided to sell him for other players, a so-called trade, or unless they decided that he could no longer play baseball at the major league level and released him. But the player had no options at all. Now, it's obvious what that does to a salary structure. There's no bargaining ability, no bargaining power at all. When an owner can tell a player, whether his name is John Smith or Joe DiMaggio, you'll take what I offer, or you can go pick cotton, because you cannot use your skills anywhere in the world to play baseball. Well, that system does more than exploit a player money-wise, because when you're owned like that, when you're a piece of property like that, there can be no essential dignity in the workplace. It is just out of the question. And it was perhaps the manifestation of that and what it meant that began to bother the players far more than money. And I think fans don't quite understand that the money was a byproduct of changing the reserve system. Changing the reserve system was first and foremost a dignity question and a career question. You know that in those days there were organizations where players with great ability were simply kept in a subsidiary role because that team happened to be really strong at that position, and he was kept simply in reserve, even though if he could have gone to another employer, another team, he had the potential of being an everyday player and a star and maybe even a superstar. So career-wise, the players felt restless about the reserve rules. And it still had nothing to do with money, or only indirectly. Major league players are competitive people. They want to play. And a man who thinks that he has the ability to play every day but is being kept as a platoon player or on a bench as a utility player is a very unhappy man, and it's separate from being unhappy about salary.
Curt Flood was the Neil Armstrong, the first man to set his foot on the moon.
Yeah, Curt Flood, as people may remember, was an outstanding center fielder for the St. Louis Cardinals. Perhaps at the time, at the end of 1969, the outstanding center fielder in the game. Willie Mays was down to his last few years. Curt had been with the Cardinals for about 12 years, almost his entire major league career. He lived there. His family was there. He had a home there. He was beginning to look into possibilities of post-baseball business as a portrait painter in St. Louis, and woke up one morning in the winter and was told, "You don't live here anymore." Now, this had happened, of course, to thousands of players before him, but Flood felt that it really was inappropriate, especially the way it was handled, and felt that it was important to again test whether baseball could do this under the antitrust laws. Baseball is a monopoly. It got an antitrust exemption by virtue of a fluke decision of the court in 1922. I sat down with Curt, as did the general counsel of the Players Association, Dick Moss, because we wanted to make sure that Curt Flood understood what the odds were against him. We didn't want somebody to take chances on ending his career without knowing what the potential was and was not. And we explained that the odds were against the Supreme Court reversing itself. And we pointed out that at age 31, while that was not old, if he had to be out of baseball for a year or two to fight this case, coming back in as skilled a game as this is, again, the odds are tremendously against you. Kurt understood and appreciated our concern about him, but said he felt that on principle this was important to pursue for the future of other players who were yet to come. And it was a most principled and courageous decision. Kurt Flood is quite a guy. And, of course, the case was prosecuted all the way through the Supreme Court. Case lost. Court voted against Flood 5-3 with one justice abstaining. All they did is simply uphold the rather poor decision of the court in 1922 and again in 1953. At the time, I used to think that the proper way to describe that case was that it lost. I have since altered my judgment about that, because I think sometimes when you think you lose, you win. And this was one of those, because what that case accomplished really, in a term that's been much overused, it raised consciousness. It raised the consciousness of people about what the reserve rules were and how horrible. And most importantly, it raised the consciousness of other players. And that led to other great things, which eventually resulted in free agency and amending the reserve rules. So I think it was a winner.
The combination of that happening and the Mets winning the World Series, gee, there's two miracles. If those two things can happen, anything can happen.
I think that's right.
I'm running out of time awfully quickly, but I also did want to ask, there are so many young people today, just in general, who don't realize what Martin Luther King, the whole civil rights movement, did for them. Are there young ball players who have no conception of what you and Curt Flood and dozens of others like you did for them?
Well, possibly. And again, that's another reason why I felt it was important to get these exciting developments of those 25 years down on black and white and on paper in a whole different ballgame. I think the answer is both yes and no. I think that there are some players who know the history of the game and who really understand, and some who do not. And in that respect, players are not different from other people. Most of the rest of us have some deficiencies in terms of realizing what it took to get us what we have. Some of us know the history, some do not, and ball players are people. Some know their history and some don't.
Marvin Miller died in 2012 at the age of 95. He was elected to baseball's Hall of Fame 7 years later. Now you can get your copy of A Whole Different Ballgame by Marvin Miller by tapping the link in our show notes, by clicking the link in the description below if you're listening to this on YouTube, or by going to our website, heardeverything.com. We may earn an Amazon commission if you make a purchase. Heardeverything.com is where you can also find my 1990 interview with the famed attorney and negotiator who used to negotiate contracts for Carl Yastrzemski, among many others, my interview with Bob Wolf.
The most important, and I really dwell on this, is keep your emotions out of the negotiation. Keep your ego out of the negotiation, and don't get hurt feelings, and because wars start that way.
And my 1997 conversation with the former United States Secretary of Labor, Robert Reich.
When I was a public official not too long ago, I had to watch my words. I mean, I got in trouble even for what I said. When I talked about corporate welfare, it was like a bomb went off.
And of course, we post new episodes of Now I've Heard Everything every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And you can find us everywhere you listen to podcasts. And thank you so much for listening. Next time on Now I've Heard Everything, as you know, in the fall we're going to be electing a president. No matter who wins the election, a different family is going to be moving into the White House. So we'll revisit my 1987 interview with the man who, for over many administrations, many years, cooked dinners at the White House, former White House chef Henry Haller.
The Carters only wanted desserts when they had guests, so did the Fords and the Nixons. President Johnson always wanted dessert, and also the Reagan family, they want dessert all the time.
That's next time on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson.